Welcome to my thesis for not only one of the greatest sequels of all time, but one of the greatest films of all time, The Empire Strikes Back. This film truly exemplifies lightning striking twice. Now, the original Star Wars illustrates lightning being captured inside of a bottle due to the collaborative efforts of so many talented individuals. Then this film does that as well, only it does it 100-fold. Blood, sweat, and tears went into the making of this film. There were many hardships on set. There were many artistic disagreements as far as how to approach the making of this film between George Lucas, director Irving Kirschner, and producer Gary Kurtz. Now, I take no sides in this issue because I truly believe that the hardships and the artistic disagreements ultimately led to why this film is so special and why it is the masterpiece that it is today. Now, this film represents the fight against the Hollywood system for independence, which was fought by George Lucas, and it represents facing the darkness within oneself, seeing something universal beyond the material world, and the fight between good and evil that's embedded in the human experience. George Lucas, director Irving Kirschner, producer Gary Kurtz, writers Lawrence Kasdan and Lee Brackett, puppeteer Frank Oz, the performances of Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, Harrison Ford, Billy D. Williams, James Earl Jones, the work of Industrial Light and Magic, Ben Burtt's sound mix, and John Williams' epic score, and more talented individuals are why this film is the masterpiece that it is today. So take this journey with me as we analyze and explore the themes of The Empire Strikes Back, one of the greatest films of all time. The Empire Strikes Back was released into theaters on May 21st, 1980, directed by Irving Kirschner and written by George Lucas, Lawrence Kasdan, and Lee Brackett. It is not only one of the greatest sequels of all time, but one of the greatest films of all time. This film truly exemplifies the rare example of lightning striking twice. The original Star Wars film was a very special case of lightning being captured inside of a bottle due to the collaborative efforts of many talented individuals. The Empire Strikes Back takes this sentiment and multiplies it exponentially through the blood, sweat, and tears of the many talented contributors involved. I cannot emphasize on this enough. Blood, sweat, and tears. The making of this film entailed numerous hardships, overwhelming challenges, and many creative differences. As George Lucas stepped out of the director's chair to act as producer, giving the reins of directing to his USC mentor, Irving Kirschner, differences in directorial style with an emphasis on character and numerous challenges associated with filming on location in extreme weather and other unforeseen circumstances would cause this film to go over schedule and over budget, causing much distress for Lucas because he was financing the film by himself and ultimately fighting for his independence with this film. That's one thing that this film represents: the fight for independence and full creative control from the Hollywood system without compromising the integrity of the art, because Lucas funded this film all by himself, and if this film had failed, he would have lost everything, all the rights to the possible sequels and the merchandising rights as well. Ultimately, the hardships encountered during the making of this film would have a significant impact on how the subsequent films in the Star Wars saga would be made, for better or for worse, depending on your creative goals. It is of my opinion that after the making of this film, George placed a greater emphasis on wanting to simply tell his story rather than making good cinema, because sometimes making good cinema requires a significant amount of endurance and stamina. And moving forward after this film, George was no longer merely a director, but the head of a corporation whose aims were much greater than making good cinema. Another thing that this film represents thematically is facing the darkness within oneself, realizing that you are your greatest enemy, and how we, as living beings, are part of a larger universe that is beyond the material world, and how the forces of good and evil are embedded in the human experience. The way the force is expanded upon in this film further broadened its universality and resonated with so many people because of the way the message is universal and inherently present in most world religions. Furthermore, this film truly represents the beginning of the Star Wars saga, which was immediately born when Lucas made the decision after several drafts to make Darth Vader Luke's father and to change the title of the film from Episode 2 to Episode 5, engraving the prequel trilogy into the saga forever, even though its fruition was nearly 20 years away from seeing the light of day. This film is an art house masterpiece. It is poetry in motion. Cinematographer Peter Suchitsky and set designer Norman Reynolds deserve so much credit for achieving the beautiful aesthetics for this film. I feel so immersed into the environment of the film. I feel like I'm looking into a window into another world. This is not just merely a science fiction fantasy film, but a character driven film within another world that has been fully realized by the filmmakers involved. Every frame of this film is art. The level of detail in the set design, the models, the animatronics, and world building is impeccable. Irving Kirschner's directing truly brought out some of the greatest performances in the saga, with his special attention to character, especially in the scenes involving Mark Hamill and puppeteer and voice actor Frank Oz, which is something truly magical. The collaboration between Mark Hamill and Frank Oz truly made Yoda feel like a believable character and not merely just a puppet. Now, in my thesis and analysis for the original Star Wars film, I noted how that film contains the entirety of the hero's journey, but also how simultaneously Luke's journey as a hero is told in the entire trilogy as well. Therefore, if we step back and view the trilogy as a whole, even though there is the entirety of the hero's journey in the first Star Wars, we can see the second chapter of the trilogy continuing the stages that were initially started in the first film. In the first film, Luke has his call to adventure, his initial refusal, and he encounters his mentor, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he accepts his destiny by crossing the threshold by saying he wants to know the ways of the Force and be a Jedi like his father, and joining the rebellion in the fight against the Empire. However, since he loses his mentor, Obi-Wan, Yoda now takes over as his mentor, and the progression of the hero's journey can continue when viewed on a macro level, the entirety of the original trilogy. In The Empire Strikes Back, the stages of Luke's journey as a hero continues when he encounters many tests, allies, and enemies, such as his experience on Dagobah, especially in the cave. He also encounters the stage of approach when he attempts to rescue his friends from the Empire on Cloud City. Finally, he also experiences the ordeal stage, the ultimate ordeal, when he confronts Vader only to be given the revelation that one of the most evil individuals in the galaxy is his father. The Empire Strikes Back is the perfect example of the second film in a trilogy, and I love how the climax of the film isn't an epic action sequence, but rather an epic emotional climax. The budget for this film is way bigger than the first Star Wars film, and as a result, the world is bigger. The world building in this film is unrivaled, especially when it comes to learning more about the Force through the tutelage of Yoda. Now, the reason why Lucas chose to step away from directing duties is because Lucas was expanding his Lucasfilm empire and because of the challenging experiences he encountered when he was directing the original Star Wars. The challenges of shooting on location in Tunisia with its overwhelming heat and the numerous breakdowns in props and set pieces. To help write the film, George Lucas hired legendary writer Lee Brackett, who had written films for Robert Altman and Alfred Hitchcock. She was primarily known to George Lucas for her legendary work with director Howard Hawks, for his screen adaptation of Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, and several of Howard Hawks' John Wayne films, including Rio Bravo, Hatari, and El Dorado. Furthermore, Lee Brackett was a legendary writer of pulp science fiction in the 1940s and 50s and a writer of crime novels as well. On November 28, 1977, writing began for Empire Strikes Back, which at the time was the second chapter of the Star Wars saga, and it wouldn't be until later in the writing process that the film would transform into Episode 5, because when the first draft was completed, the film was titled Episode 2 and not Episode 5. The development of the Yoda character and the expanding on the Force and its meaning was paramount to the film working, and Lucas and Lee had numerous discussions about this. George Lucas states, in the process of rewriting the first Star Wars script and thinking of it as only a movie and not a whole trilogy, I decided that Ben Kenobi really didn't serve any useful function after the point he fights with Darth Vader. I said, he just stands around for the last 25% of the film watching this air battle go on. So, in the case of Ben Kenobi, I had Luke being trained by Ben, only I had killed Ben off. So now I had to come up with another Jedi who was older and wiser and shorter than Ben to train Luke, and that was the beginning premise of Yoda. Now, this is an interesting quote because it wasn't necessarily George Lucas who decided that Ben Kenobi should be killed off in the first Star Wars film. If you see my review for that film and the extensive research that was undertaken, it was George Lucas's wife, Marcia Lucas, who recommended that to him. And he reluctantly chose to move forward with that. And when the film worked, he obviously liked the decision. And I just felt that was important, and I had to add that because that is factual. Yoda tells a fairy tale to Luke, reads one of Lucas's notes. We are not material. We are luminous beings who are tied together by the Force. The light field does not exist. Energy does flow. When you are born, you have an energy field around you. You could call it an aura. An archaic description would be a halo. It's an idea that has gone all the way through history. When you die, your energy fields join all the other energy fields in the universe. And while you're still living, that larger energy field is sympathetic to your own energy field, George Lucas says. Another thing that was expanded upon was Han Solo's background and the introduction of Lando, and the possibility of him being a clone. Now, the importance of the confrontation between Luke and Vader was also paramount to the film working. Now, the character Boba Fett, who was originally introduced to the Star Wars community in the Star Wars Holiday Special animated segment, was designed by artist Joe Johnston, who is also a great director in his own right, making such films as Jurassic Park 3, The Rocketeer, and Captain America the First Avenger. In addition, Joe Johnston also created the AT-AT walkers and helped design Yoda, along with Stuart Freeborn, who was responsible for the makeup creature design and who based the final mold of Yoda's face off of a self-portrait of himself. Now, in regards to Boba Fett, part of his background seemed to tie in to the Clone Wars. And in the Empire Strikes Back novelization, there is a quote. Fett was dressed in a weapon covered armored spacesuit, the kind worn by a group of evil warriors defeated by the Jedi Knights during the Clone Wars, author Donald F. Glut writes. So, as you can see, at this moment in time when The Empire Strikes Back was being made, George Lucas had no idea that Boba Fett was going to have a strong relation to the Clone Wars. He had no idea that he was going to be a clone or that his father was going to be the clone template. Now, another interesting development that was brought forth during the beginning writing process for the film was that stormtroopers were clones. In the book, The World of Star Wars, a compendium of fact and fantasy from Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, it states the creation of an Imperial stormtrooper, a cloned man, is one of a group of genetically identical humans, an assembly line product. He is a thinking man, but he serves a specific purpose and no other. A clone has no mother, only his trainers, and he accepts his fate because he believes it is inevitable. A clone is physically and emotionally a normal man. He simply has no human rights and no name. He is the property of the emperor. Now, unfortunately, immediately after the completion of the first draft, Lee Brackett passed away from cancer on March 18th, 1978. For the first draft, it is important to note that Darth Vader was still not Luke Skywalker's father, and that there was actually a scene in the first draft in which Luke's father's ghost speaks to him on Dagobah. In addition, Han Solo also was not frozen in carbonite. Another extremely important thing to note is that in Lee Brackett's first draft on Empire Strikes Back, Luke's sister was not Leia, but a whole other character named Nelith, which was revealed to Luke by his father when he was still considered a different character and not Darth Vader. This was the reason why Luke and Leia had incestuous moments, especially in a deleted scene for The Empire Strikes Back that was released for the Blu ray release. When we view this deleted scene and other promotional materials that were released for The Empire Strikes Back that depict Luke and Leia in romantic moments, it is clear that George Lucas had no idea that Leia was going to be Luke's sister when The Empire Strikes Back was made. Now let's read from Lee Brackett's first draft. And obviously we can see if you look at the screen right now that there has been revisions made by George Lucas, crossing out with pencil, pen, whatever. But let's just read the actual initial writing that was typed up by Lee Brackett. Another half ghostly form emerges from the mist. A tall, fine looking man who approaches Luke slowly. Ben Kenobi says, "Your father." Luke responds, "My father?" Even with his newfound maturity, Luke finds this an awesome, not to say shattering moment. They look at each other. Anakin Skywalker says, "You've grown well, Luke. I'm proud of you." Luke, not knowing what to say, says nothing. Anakin Skywalker continues, "Did your uncle ever speak to you about Nelith?" Luke responds, "Nelith? No, who is she?" Anakin Skywalker replies, "Your sister." Luke replies, "My sister? I have a sister? But why didn't Uncle Owen?" Anakin states, "It was my request. When I saw the Empire closing in, I sent you both away for your own safety, far apart from each other." Luke asked, "Where is she? What's her name?" If I were to tell you Darth Vader could get that information from your mind and use her as a hostage, not yet, Luke, when it's time. He looks gravely at his son. Luke, will you take from me the oath of a Jedi Knight? Again, this further illustrates that Lucas did not have everything planned out from the beginning, like he insists, but rather made it up as he went along. When this There Was Another dialogue was initially put into the script, George Lucas had no idea that the other was going to be Leia when he put that in there. Now, Lucas, during this time, was toying with the idea that Luke had a sister, but it was not Leia. it was going to be a completely different character. George Lucas states, I also want to develop Luke's sister. The idea is that Luke's father had two children who were twins. He took one of them to an uncle on one side of the universe and one to the other side of the universe so that they would be safe. If one got killed, the other wouldn't even know that the other one was there. She also becomes a Jedi. She's doing the same thing simultaneously that Luke is doing. Eventually, in some episode, not this one, we could cope with Luke and his sister and how she is the female Jedi and he is the male Jedi. Luke gets his awareness of his lost sister through Jedi training. We can come up with some interesting pieces of background. Another reason why Lucas initially placed this in there is to give the audience a sense that Luke could possibly die and be replaced with another protagonist in order to create suspense. George Lucas states, I was trying to set up subliminally in the audience's mind that something is going on here, that Luke could fail, and if he does fail, there is another hope. So the audience is saying, don't go, finish your training. Now, with these findings well documented in George Lucas's own words, we can see that despite what Lucas insists today, that Lucas did not have everything planned out from the beginning, and that the evolution of the Star Wars saga was an innovative process, being made up as he went along. Now, there is nothing wrong with this, and in fact, this is just a reality of filmmaking. Now, here is an interesting quote from George Lucas regarding the choice to make Darth Vader Luke's father. I didn't discuss the notion of Vader being Luke's father with Lee Brackett. At that point, I wasn't sure if I was going to include it in the script or reveal it in the third episode. I was going back and forth, and rather than confuse things for Lee, I decided to keep the whole issue out of the mix. I figured I would add it later on. Now, when the second draft was completed, this is when the Star Wars saga was truly conceived, as we know it today, because the titling of the script as Episode 5 and no longer being Episode 2 would introduce the notion of a prequel trilogy to the world, and Darth Vader was reintroduced to the world as Luke's father. George Lucas states, I hired Lee Brackett to write the screenplay, but tragically she died right after completing the first draft. Faced with the situation that somebody had to step in and do a rewrite, I was forced to write the second draft of this screenplay. But I found it much easier than I had expected, almost enjoyable. The following quotes reveal Lucas's brainstorming regarding Vader's new story, now that he is the father of Luke Skywalker, something that wasn't conceived even in the slightest when the original Star Wars was released. After the snow planet attack and everybody escapes, that's when he might go into isolation. Maybe this is a good time to talk about the Emperor as this terrible force. Vader is really afraid of the Emperor. That's the only thing Vader is afraid of. The best way to set up a supervillain is to take the biggest villain you've got and make him afraid of the supervillain. The Emperor is even more powerful than Vader. He's the classic devil character, a hooded, dark figure. You can't even see who he is. Vader started getting fascinated with the dark side of the Force and was lured into it. He didn't tell anybody, as he became an evil person. The evil force was starting to take over the galaxy. It was in control of the Emperor. He began to get more power, and the Senate was getting less powerful. No one knew that he had been seduced, but he went around killing all these Jedi in secret. He killed a bunch of them and trapped the others in a situation where they were all destroyed. Only a few escaped. One of them was Ben. Now, I really like this quote, and I really think this is better than what went down in Revenge of the Sith. So, this is very interesting to me. Another quote from George Lucas, Vader is completely consumed by the evil side of the Force. He is an instrument of the Force rather than having his own free will in terms of what he does. He really is driven by the Force. When we kill him off in the next one, we'll reveal what he really is. He wants to be human. He's still fighting in his own way the dark side of the Force. He doesn't want to be a bad man, but he is. He can't resist it. He's struggling somehow to get out what he is, struggling with his humanity. Now, this right here, this quote reveals a notion of what is going to be in Return of the Jedi, which is the redemption of Darth Vader, that there is still good in him. Another quote from George Lucas: I like the end conflict to be a moral conflict, in addition to a physical one. It should have Vader using a moral law that we learned earlier, but Vader turns it around. It has to be a mystical thing, something you can look at from two sides. In the end, Vader is trying to undo everything Luke just learned. The real drama is whether Luke will become Darth Vader or not. We have tested him, and we know he is weak. He really had to struggle to stay good. He has the same potentiality that Darth Vader had. Along with these important story developments for the Darth Vader character, The Empire Strikes Back finally gives us a glimpse into who the actual Emperor is, a character that was only briefly mentioned in the original Star Wars. Initially, when the original film was released, the Emperor was a victim, a puppet that was being manipulated, but The Empire Strikes Back changed this and turned him from a puppet into the puppet master. This further illustrates that Lucas did not have everything plotted out from the very beginning. And with these changes also comes the foundations for the prequel trilogy that would be released nearly 20 years from the release of Empire Strikes Back. As previously stated, originally in the 1976 novelization of the original Star Wars film, Palpatine was a puppet. And what seemed to happen in the writing process was that Lucas combined this idea with his unused idea from the drafts of the original Star Wars, in which a character named Valorum, who was a Sith Lord, was the mastermind and ultimate villain in the story. This is taken from the opening novelization of the original Star Wars. Once under the wise rule of the Senate and the protection of the Jedi Knights, the Republic throve and grew. But as often happens when wealth and power pass beyond the admirable and attain the awesome, then appear those evil ones who have greed to match. So it was with the Republic at its height. Like the greatest of trees able to withstand any external attack, the Republic was rotted from within, though the danger was not visible from outside. Aided and abetted by restless, power hungry individuals within the government and the massive organs of commerce, the ambitious Senator Palpatine caused himself to be elected President of the Republic. He promised to unite the disaffected among the people and to restore the remembered glory of the Republic. Once secure in office, he declared himself emperor, shutting himself away from the populace. Soon he was controlled by the very assistants and bootlickers he had appointed to high office, and the cries of the people did not reach his ears. Having exterminated through treachery and deception the Jedi Knights, guardians of justice in the galaxy, the imperial governors and bureaucrats prepared to institute a reign of terror among the disheartened worlds of the galaxy. Many used the imperial forces and the name of the increasingly isolated emperor to further their own personal ambitions. But a small number of systems rebelled at these new outrages. Declaring themselves opposed to the new order, they began the great battle to restore the Republic. From the first saga, Journal of the Wills. Now, again, that was taken from the introduction of the novelization for the original Star Wars film. And now I have a very interesting quote from George Lucas regarding the development of the emperor and how the empire came to be. In the Old Republic, all the systems sent their representatives to the Senate. It wasn't an imperial Senate, it was a Republican Senate, which made the decisions that controlled the Republic. There were 24,372 systems in the Galactic Senate. The Senate would vote in a chancellor and an overseer who would work for 4 years as the leader of the executive branch of the Republic. You were only supposed to be able to run for one 4 year term. You were only eligible for one term. What happened was one of the chancellors began subverting the Senate and buying off the senators with the help of some of the large intergalactic trade companies and mining companies. Through their power and money, he bought off enough of the Senate to get himself elected to a second term because of a crisis. By the time the third term came along, he had corrupted so much of the Senate that they made him emperor for the rest of his life. Giving the emperor that title for life and doing away with the elective process was all done with a lot of rationalizing. Many in the Senate felt that having elections and changing leaders in the time of an emergency disrupted the bureaucratic system, and the bureaucracy was getting to be so big that changing leaders made it impossible to have any effect on the system and make it work. Moreover, the bureaucracy was running amok and not paying attention to the rulers. So they reasoned that the emperor could bring the bureaucracy back into line. So the emperor took control of the bureaucracy. The Galactic Senate would meet for a period that was similar to a year. But after it became the Imperial Senate, the meetings were less and less frequent until finally the meetings were only once a year and they were very short. With the bureaucracy behind the emperor, it was impossible and too late for the Senate to do anything. He has slowly manipulated things. In fact, it was he who let the bureaucracy run amok and therefore had blackmailed the Senate into doing things because he was the only one who really had any power over the bureaucracy. It was so large there was no way to getting things done, but he knew the right people. The key people in the bureaucracy were working for him and were paid by the companies. Now, Lucas continues. When he became emperor, a little over half the Senate, as it turned out, was not involved, was not corrupted, and they reacted strongly against the whole thing. There was a rebellion in terms of the Senate against the emperor. They tried to oust him legally and have him impeached, but many of the senators who were fighting the emperor at the time mysteriously died. The Jedi Knights were alerted immediately, and they rallied to the Senate's side. But there was a plot afoot. When the Jedi finally rallied and tried to restore order, they were betrayed and eventually killed by Darth Vader. Now, these are very interesting quotes from George Lucas, and I really like his ideas here. And I prefer them much more strongly than what we eventually got in The Phantom Menace and in the rest of the prequel films, because here there was a level of sophistication that was not seen in those films. Now, as pre production was nearing completion, George Lucas hired writer Lawrence Kasdan, writer of the first Indiana Jones film, Raiders of the Lost Ark, to aid him in writing the screenplay. And he hired director Irving Kirschner to make the film while he financed and produced. An important factor in the hiring of Kirschner was that Lucas promised him that it would be his film. The following is a quote from Irving Kirschner. Why did George Lucas choose me to direct? That's what 20th Century Fox wanted to know, because they thought I was too old. I was over 55. They said, get a young man, get someone in their 30s, someone who will understand the kids. But George said no, he wanted me. George had been in my classes, my seminars at USC. I was teaching there, on and off, and we became friends. Later, we would meet every once in a while, and he would talk about some of the films I'd done. Eyes of Laura Mars, The Return of a Man Called Horse, and The Flim Flam Man. He loved them. I want you to do the film, he said, because you know everything a Hollywood director's supposed to know, but you're not Hollywood. I turned it down. I told him, I don't know anything about special effects, but he said, you don't have to. You think up anything you want, and it's up to industrial light and magic to make it work. Now, I don't know of anyone else who could have said that, but he owns the company. So I'd ask for the most impossible shots, and they would do it. George Lucas states, Kirsch asked me why I didn't direct Empire myself. You'll see these films are infinitely harder than any other movie. You end up feeling like a harassed corporate executive. I had no life other than making the movie. I had to take time out to be a normal person. Irving Kirschner adds, we talked about old times. George said that it was so difficult to do the first one that I would be crazy to do the second one. He said, boy, I couldn't get up in the mornings after a while. 6 months of shooting is very, very hard. Everything goes wrong. So he said, I want somebody who, under tremendous pressure, will not cave in. Somebody who has a vast experience in films and likes to deal with people and characters. I felt very flattered. He knew how to get to me, the rat. I told George that the only way I do the film is if I felt I could top the first one. He laughed and said that's why he wanted me to do it. He said, it's not a sequel. This is a continuing saga. I said that under certain conditions, I'd make the film. First of all, if I felt that I could make a film that was better than the first one, that meant having freedom and sufficient money. George assured me that money was not a problem, within limits, of course. He further assured me that it would be my film completely. He also knew that I was disciplined and therefore would plan it well and respect the budget. Now, despite all the good intentions of George Lucas, Irving Kirschner, and producer Gary Kurtz in regards to working together, the making of the film was filled with many conflicts, with Lucas wanting the shoot to be more expedient due to the film falling behind schedule, going over budget, and especially him financing the film all by himself, while Kirschner and Kurtz wanted to take more time to focus on character and getting the details absolutely right for certain shots. For me, this was the beginning of the schism in Star Wars, a division that would trickle on down into the fan base. Why? Because this film and the prior film, which was created under restrictive circumstances such as limited budget, would ultimately distinguish themselves from all Star Wars films moving forward. The intent of Empire Strikes Back, and to a lesser extent the original Star Wars, was initially to make good cinema, but after Lucas's difficult experiences working with others on Empire Strikes Back, he focused on simply getting the story told expediently, and he allowed aspects such as character and cinematic language to take a back seat with the subsequent films. Furthermore, you have to remember that Lucas had numerous goals in mind while making Empire Strikes Back. Lucas was thinking of expanding his company and making Skywalker Ranch, so he was no longer just a director focusing on the current film being made. He was focusing on the Lucasfilm empire in its totality. In regards to this schism and how it impacted the fans, you have some that subscribe to the notion that Star Wars should be held to a high standard, a cinematic masterpiece. And then you have other fans who simply want fun escapism in the memory of old Flash Gordon serials and who are not too focused upon good dialogue and good camera work. It's a very interesting thesis that I propose. Nevertheless, these conflicts are what made the film the masterpiece it is today. And I don't take any sides. I totally understand where both Lucas and Kirschner were coming from. Lucas was financing the film all by himself, and his money is a finite thing. And if the film was to be a failure, he would have been ruined. There is no doubt in my mind that if I were in George Lucas's shoes, I would have been upset at times as well. And yet at the same time, I love how Kirschner wanted to focus on character and take time to find something special with the actors and the scenes. Blood, sweat, and tears, indeed. Tom Pollock, famous Hollywood attorney that brokered the epic deal for George Lucas to retain the rights to the sequels and the merchandising rights, recollects Castan's main criticism was that Lucas glossed over the emotional content of a scene in his hurry to get to the next one. Lucas's response to these criticisms was characteristic of his storytelling philosophy. Well, if we have enough action, nobody will notice. He's afraid of going too slow, Kurtz remarks. Pollock reports that Lucas's script was also plagued by poor dialogue and thin characterization. Coston says of Lucas's drafts, there were sections of the script which, when I read them, made me say to myself, I can't believe George wrote this scene. It's terrible. George doesn't care about the relationships between people beyond the broad strokes. He's not interested in the humor that could be wrung from understanding the characters' eccentricities. If the humor isn't there in the simple version of a scene he has to do, he's not interested in it. What he's interested in is moving the plot forward. He doesn't want a 3-minute scene about character. So he's the opposite of me that way. I'm not interested in plot. I'm interested in characters surprising you. Scenes when you discover something new about them or they change their relationship to each other. I like fast moving narratives too, so it was easy for me to get on George's train. I just wanted to mix it up. That's not to say he isn't interested in larger matters. He's always filling out some large scheme, and the people are there in his movies to represent different philosophical constructs, says Lawrence Kasdan. The director needs to do what he needs to do. That's all, Kurt says simply. But Lucas saw it differently. Gary never said no to anything. In their daily telephone calls, he urged Kirschner and Kurtz to scale down and speed up. George wasn't here, Kurtz notes. I was here. He was back there working with ILM, getting the visual parts together. I kept telling George, look, you've got to let me do this my way, because if you push him too hard, it'll just make things worse, not better. I've seen it. I've experienced it myself. What we're getting is very good. Don't make it worse than it is. Irving Kirschner states, in terms of just the logistics, George would have been much happier had I been able to shoot it faster. But frankly, to get what I was trying to get, I couldn't. I couldn't get the performances as well. I'll give you an example. We were shooting a very difficult scene with Harrison, and there were some special effects in the scene. We shot it in one take, and I said, that's it. We move on. Harrison said, wait, hold it. Tell me something. Was I good? Or did the special effects work and therefore you just don't want to shoot again? I said, Harrison, by now you gotta trust me. You were great. The special effects happened to work, but you were great. And he looked at me with that wonderful look of his, like, okay, he said, and he pointed his finger at me, wagging it, and said, now you better watch yourself, because the temptation, if the special effects work, is to say, okay, the performance is good enough. Well, I couldn't get away with that with Harrison. And I didn't want to get away with anything with Mark because I knew it was important for him and for Carrie. So I'd have one eye on the special effects and one eye on my characters. And boy, they better come together or else it didn't work. Initially, George Lucas had reservations about bringing Kurtz back as producer. He is quoted as saying, I suspected there would be problems and I knew I was asking for trouble. Gary Kurtz would say, one of the arguments that I had with George about Empire was the fact that he felt in the end, he said, we could have made just as much money if the film hadn't been quite so good. and you hadn't spent so much time. And I said, but it was worth it. George Lucas is quoted as saying, it looks pretty because Kirsch took a lot of time to do it. It's a great luxury that we really couldn't afford, and ultimately, it doesn't make that much difference. It was just a lot better than I wanted to make it. Now, sometime during the making of The Empire Strikes Back, George Lucas was unhappy with the footage that was being shot and he attempted to edit the film himself. He was quoted as saying, I was extremely upset because I felt it wasn't working at all. Here I was, way over budget, running out of money, and I had a movie I thought was no good. Hollywood attorney Dale Pollock recounts Lucas's revised version was heavily criticized by Kirschner, editor Paul Hirsch, and Gary Kurtz. A lot of it didn't work and some of it was cut too fast, Kirschner says. Lucas finally lost his temper. Dwayne Dunham, who accompanied George, sat in amazement as his boss exploded. You guys are ruining my picture. You are here messing around and we're trying to save this thing. Kirsch calmly pointed out what he thought Lucas had done wrong, but George became even more upset. It's my money, it's my film, and I'm going to do it the way I want to do it, he declared. George Lucas is further quoted as saying, I never got on Kirsch about the fact that he was overscheduled and putting a great burden on me and my life. Everything I owned was wrapped up in that damn movie. If he blew it, I lost everything. Lucas also says, I had struggled to get this thing in shape by recutting it, but they were right. It really didn't work very well. That's what made me angry. I couldn't make it work. Irving Kirschner states, it had to be slower and more lyrical. The themes have to be more interior, and you don't have a grand climax. George Lucas states, I appreciated what Kirsch was trying to do and I sympathized with his problems. The film was well directed. It was just differently directed. Now, Lawrence Kasdan makes a distinction between Irving Kirschner's directing style and Richard Marquand, director of The Return of the Jedi style. It has a quality I think Kirsch gave it. It's just not like any of the others. I really love Richard Marquand, but he did not put as distinctive a stamp. But I think Kirsch just directed Empire great. He loosened up George in a lot of ways. George wanted the movie to be his, the way he wanted, but he knew how to use Kirsch and trust him, even though it scared George at times. Now, another controversial aspect regarding the making of The Empire Strikes Back involves having to replace some of George's special effects personnel, notably John Dykstra, inventor of the motion control camera that pioneered the special effects for the original Star Wars, with whom Lucas had a difficult working relationship with on Star Wars. I think we would have gotten rid of him except for the fact that there were about five key people that worked directly with John and were very close friends of his, Lucas says. We felt we only had half the time we needed to finish the movie. If we had lost five or six of our key people at that point, it would have been really disastrous. But there were some very upsetting times, a lot of yelling and screaming going on. So, with that quote right there, it illustrates that George had such a difficult relationship with John Dykstra when they were making the first Star Wars movie that he wanted to fire him while they were working on the first Star Wars film together. Now, as a result of this, George Lucas had to rebuild Industrial Light and Magic all over again. This would be visual effects supervisors Dennis Marine's time to shine, along with his fellow peers Brian Johnson, Richard Edlund, Ken Ralston, and Phil Tippett. The stop motion animation was exceptionally well executed in the film and mind blowing, especially for the Battle of Hoth. You really feel like you're part of the battle, like you're right there. It totally has a documentary type of aesthetic to it, and I really feel like the stop motion effects look far more believable than today's CGI. I also share this sentiment with the asteroid chase. The motion camera effects and the model work here look infinitely superior to the CGI work that we see today, in modern blockbuster films. Also, the level of suspense and excitement that is generated in these scenes is exceptional, and they truly feel like edge of your seat moments. In regards to the dialogue between Han and Leia, it is such a well written romance. It has wit and humor, and Lawrence Kasdan did an excellent job with making their relationship feel genuine. I love the whole push and pull of their relationship, and it is so well acted by Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher that you feel like you are peeking into a relationship's private moments. And Ford's improvisation when he responds to Leia's I love you with I know truly illustrates his skill as an actor and how well he knew the character in comparison with the screenwriters. Yes, that line was totally improvised by Harrison Ford because he felt like Han replying, I love you too, was something that Han Solo wouldn't say, and he is absolutely right about that. Now, in regards to more humorous moments, such as the banter between R2D2 and C3PO and how the Millennium Falcon keeps breaking down, I think the humor is done so well in conjunction with the dark tone of the film. For me, the reason why the humor works is because it is written with wit and because it's savvy. This is why it works so well compared to, say, the baby toddler humor from Jar Jar Binks in The Phantom Menace, which felt like cheap gags and fell so flat. Irving Kirschner said that he knew the film had to have humor, but he couldn't have gags, and he was absolutely right about that. Now, in regards to the growing tension between George Lucas and Gary Kurtz during the making of this film, Film Threat magazine has an interview with Gary Kurtz that elaborates more on this. So, when did you and George Lucas start to not see things the same way? What was the beginning of it? Kurtz replies, I think that was during the making of Empire. George got really concerned about how long we were taking. We didn't go over budget, and he banged me for the cost overruns on Empire. And taking Irving Kirshner's side. And taking Irv's side, yes. It was kind of a mutual parting. It wasn't acrimonious. Kurtz also comments on the growing Lucasfilm empire and how it interfered with the making of the film. The saddest thing about watching that process was the slow takeover by the bureaucracy. With that slowly came this thing about dress code, company policy, and nobody talking to the press, and a firm of press release people, and it was quite frustrating, really. I was there longer than anybody and had been with him for the longest period of time, and I just felt that I didn't like it. The bureaucracy grew and grew. You couldn't talk to George. You had to talk to his assistant. It became more like Howard Hughes in a way. I decided I was more interested in working on interesting films than in being tied to a machine like that. Now, that being said, Kirschner and Kurtz weren't without disagreement among themselves as well. Kurtz says, sometimes Kirsch and I disagreed about how something should be done. He has a built in mania for wanting to tie everything together in a shot so that you show the foreground and background all the time. But this kind of picture, in some ways, doesn't lend itself to that. I convinced him on certain scenes that he couldn't shoot that way or we'd be here for years. On other scenes, he insisted that it was the only way to get the dramatic impact that he wanted. Now, Kirshner states, I thought it would be a more mechanical job, and it's far from mechanical. There are tremendous changes taking place moment to moment. What I do at the last minute is I make an adjustment. They're adjustments, not changes of mine. The conceptual base is what I rarely change. We're making a big enough film so that we have to believe in the integrity of the entire project, which means occasionally making adjustments, and that throws very rigid people. It also throws people that think of film as shots and not as building blocks of a film. A film is not made up of shots, it's made up of a much more complex system of units which interconnect in an incredibly precise way. Now, these two quotes right here, contrasting between Kurtz and Kirschner, totally illustrates the outlook of the producer and the director, how they both view things differently, and how sometimes these outlooks clash with one another. It's very interesting. Blood, sweat, and tears, people. Now, I really like how Luke goes into a meditative trance when he is captured by the Wampa on Hoth. It exemplifies how he relied on an inner strength. He silenced the fear in himself in order to utilize the Force to bring his lightsaber to him, and I thought this was a very powerful moment in the film. Now, in regards to the special editions, I don't mind that they exist, but what I strongly disagree with Lucas about is his initial attempt to repress the original theatrical cuts until 2006 when he released the Laserdisc transfers on DVD. I have no problem with director's cuts, but to repress a historically important film, such as the theatrical version of The Empire Strikes Back, is not right. And I'm glad individuals such as Harmy have used the Laserdisc transfer and other sources to upscale it and create a high definition version through his despecialized edition in order to keep the legacy of the theatrical versions alive. Now, the official Blu ray release of The Empire Strikes Back looks amazing, and it is the most tolerable version of the changed versions of the original trilogy because the changes weren't so outrageous, like the ridiculous Jabba the Hutt scene that was inserted in A New Hope, or the goofy musical performance that was inserted in Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi. However, I still preferred the theatrical version of Empire Strikes Back because even though the changes are more subtle than those in the other special editions, they still matter a lot to me. I really don't like the change of dialogue and the introductory scene of the Emperor, despite my huge appreciation for having Ian McDiarmid come and reprise his role as Palpatine. In the original scene, Vader doesn't show any surprise when Palpatine mentions Luke as Anakin's son, and Palpatine states this very matter of factly. But in the new version, the Emperor specifically emphasizes that he has no doubt that Luke is the offspring of Anakin, and Vader replied, "How is that possible?" To which Palpatine tells him to search his feelings and know that it is true. The thing about this change that I don't really like is that in the opening crawl, it says that Vader is obsessed with finding Luke. Now, why would he be obsessed with finding Luke if he didn't already know that he was his son? I feel like this was unnecessary and they shouldn't have changed the dialogue, even though seeing Ian McDiarmid reprise his role as Palpatine helps resolve the continuity error from having the original actor that played Palpatine removed from the film, who was actually a juxtaposition of a woman in a cloak with monkey eyes and a voiceover from a male voice actor. In addition to this, I also prefer Boba Fett's original voice actor any day over Tamora Morrison's, despite having Morrison creating better continuity with the overall saga. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Attack of the Clones, so having the original voice actor doesn't bother me at all in this regard. And also, the original voice was just so much more menacing and closer to a cowboy bounty hunter type like from the spaghetti westerns of Sergio Leone. Now, despite these reservations regarding the special editions, I do appreciate the removal of matte lines, which makes the compositing for the special effects look amazing. To reiterate, during the making of The Empire Strikes Back, Kirschner and Gary Kurtz fell behind schedule. Kirschner states, "You can say we are behind. Actually, a schedule is a very peculiar thing, very arbitrary. A schedule was drawn up, I never approved it, and I said it probably couldn't be done. But we tried to shoot for it and now have fallen behind, though not disastrously. I like to speed things up, but there is no realistic schedule with a film like this because nobody can foresee the day to day problems." Gary Kurtz states, Kirschner is the kind of director that if you pressure him too much to the point of saying, we've got to have 4 shots by noon, it makes it worse for him. He gets slower because he's trying to figure out, let's see, if I have to scratch out all of this, I can't do this shot and I can't do that shot. And he'll sit there and brood for about 2 hours trying to figure out how to do it quickly. Well, it's not worth that. And then the scene isn't any good. So it's silly because you're ruining the one thing that makes the picture, what you've got on film. Now, because of Gary Kurtz and Irving Kirschner going over schedule, ultimately George Lucas had to take a more active role in shooting the film and being present during its production. George Lucas states, I discovered that they had started going over schedule. There were just a lot of things that had to be worked out that only I could really do. So I flew over. It began to be too much work on the film while trying to create this company. Now, this film has so many iconic scenes that transcend the Star Wars saga. Scenes like when Han puts Luke in the Tauntaun so he could survive the brutal cold. When I saw Leonardo DiCaprio doing this for himself in the film The Revenant, I was totally reminded of Han doing this for Luke in The Empire Strikes Back. The Millennium Falcon scene, where it escapes the giant space worm's belly inside the asteroid, and the way the A-Wings tripped the AT-AT walkers using their cables, which was mentioned by Spider-Man in Captain America Civil War. There are so many scenes from this film that are forever engraved in the psyche of American popular cinema. I also want to add, in regards to Han putting Luke in the Tauntaun, that this was such a great gesture of friendship on Han's behalf. The way Han reacts to the notion of possibly having to leave Luke in the freezing cold on Hoth and basically choose the possibility of his death, sacrificing his life to find Luke, was a powerful way to show how much Han values Luke as a friend. You can also see some symbolism in the scene as far as Luke having to become one with nature in order to be reborn. For me, this is the type of foreshadowing of Luke's rebirth later in the film under the tutelage of Yoda and the rite of passage he faces in his ordeal with Darth Vader, where it is revealed that one of the most evil individuals in the galaxy is his father. Now, speaking of Darth Vader, I really love the ruthlessness of Vader in this film and the great dialogue he is given, which have become so iconic. Lines such as, he is clumsy as he is stupid, and impressive, most impressive. James Earl Jones's performance is remarkable and powerful. His voice gives such an intimidating presence to the character. I also love how we briefly get a glimpse of Vader's wounds in the scene when he is in his meditation chamber and he is approached by the Imperial officer. The scene is very symbolic in how it shows how Vader is separated from humanity. The chamber is cracked open just enough to communicate, but the chamber separates a machine separated from normal men. It's also great to see Leia in a commanding position as a strong female leader, and you can tell that she is battle hardened now and taking the war very, very seriously. Now, in regards to shooting on location in Norway for the Hoth sequences, the brutal cold and the blizzards that the crew endured further contributed to the many, many pains and blood, sweat, and tears that the creators of this film encountered. Harrison Ford states, it was so cold that no equipment could be operated outside for more than 3 or 4 minutes. It all froze up. I kept asking myself how I got into this whole mess, but I couldn't have left even if I wanted to. There was no way out. Irving Kirschner adds, Mark was lying in the snow in sub zero weather, trying to emote when, within 1 minute, the chill factor was so great that his body began to shake involuntarily. Irving Kirschner continues, the interior set for the ice caverns were pretty painful. We were living for days in these man made caverns that were covered with salt for a glistening effect. There was so much salt that it got into our lungs, our pores. We could taste the salt all day and all night. And for scenes with fog or mist, we had to keep shooting heated mineral oil into the air because the effects folks claimed it was healthier than the vegetable oil used in America. After a while, we couldn't breathe, let alone smell anything. We'd leave the sets exhausted with no sense of smell, reeking of salt. Now, in order to finish the film on time, we're forced to shoot production and post production at the same time, says Gary Kurtz. Now, an interesting thing that occurred during the making of this film was an injury that Mark Hamill endured when he broke his thumb. At one point, Mark had to take a fall and he broke his thumb. The pain was excruciating. He was writhing on the floor, face contorted, covered with salt. I think at that point, he wouldn't have minded never seeing any of us ever again. Now, the scene where Mark Hamill broke his thumb is when he is in the Battle of Hoth and his A Wing crashes, and the foot of the AT-AT walker is about to come down, and he jumps out of the way just in time before he gets smashed. That is the scene where Mark Hamill broke his thumb. Now, Gary Kurtz further adds, we shut down the first unit for 4 days to let him recover. And the next day, when he came in, he yelled at me for it being my fault for having him do that jump that sprained his thumb. Maybe it was, although that particular jump was rehearsed several times by the stunt coordinator. But Mark was so keyed up because he was just getting ready to start the sword fight and had been rehearsing it for 6 or 8 weeks. He was so disappointed that he couldn't start it. At that point, his stunt double and the hairdresser came in to just check the wig to see about matching, and he got very angry and almost threw them out of the dressing room because he felt in his head that somehow we were going to shoot the sequence without him because of his thumb injury, which wasn't the case at all. When production was 30 days behind schedule, morale on set hit its lowest point. Harrison Ford hardly said goodbye to you. Alan Arnold, writer of a journal of the making of Empire, states, he said goodbye to me because I said goodbye to him, but he couldn't get away quick enough. He was exhausted emotionally and physically, says Kirschner. He just couldn't wait to leave, even though he loved doing the picture. It's a long, long schedule, and everyone's away from home. The actors were at the point of collapse and exhaustion by that time. Gary Kurtz states, I think probably the time that felt the worst was towards the end, just before Harrison Ford left. There was one week when I was sort of assaulted by everybody at the same time, Harrison, Carrie, and Mark, for various reasons. I think all of the actors had a hard time, all our young people, because the picture was very hard, very demanding on them. Mark Hamill says, there were lots of times when you say to yourself, I don't care. I hate this movie and everyone in it. I just want to go home. Gary Kurtz states, we had a lot of arguments. We were shooting in the carbon freezing chamber, and I felt that we had serious problems with both Mark and Carrie with Kirschner in terms of communication. They were talking to me in the middle of the night, and we had long sessions in the studio. And it just felt that there was tremendous barriers that we had to break through. But that's part of the job, I guess. That just happens. It was very frustrating for everybody on set, but most frustrating for the actors because that just reinforces their fear that the acting isn't as important as the technical parts of the picture. Now, in regards to Yoda, the scenes between him and Luke are what really give this film its heart and soul. These scenes are very reminiscent of scenes from Carlos Castaneda's books, in which this anthropologist undergoes an apprenticeship with Mexican shaman Don Juan Matus. The way Yoda tricks Luke and Luke's impatience and how Luke is admonished, these scenes are like how Don Juan taught Carlos Castaneda for not being in the present moment. There are also numerous spiritual teachings that could be found in the Tao Te Ching, such as how we are luminous beings of pure energy, which is also found in the books of Castaneda. This Lucas quote corroborates this. I may bring back Ben eventually. I'll have to bring back his voice. May also bring back the ghost of Ben, not the person of Ben. Luke is learning the Force through a combination of things, rituals. Some of the Force came from Carlos Castaneda's book, Tales of Power. The idea that you can see things in another dimension would work great, that Ben is now part of the Force and he can be there with Luke. As Luke goes through this experience, he begins to see Ben in this other dimension. He could begin to see his ancestors in this other dimension with the Force, which would mean we could then bring them back in a different kind of way. Ben will explain to Luke that he will gather all these powers, but you can't use them for evil or he will succumb to the dark side of the Force. If you use it for evil, it will start using you. It is a force for good, but the more you become addicted to it, the more it controls you, and the side that controls you is the bad side. The side that you can control is the good side. The good side is a passive side, and the bad side is an aggressive side. Two sides to the force. One is aggressive, one is passive in relationship to things. In one of his notes, Lucas wrote, the mood of a warrior calls at once for control and abandon. The force commands you and obeys you. Unity of opposites. If you use it well, you can see the future and the past. You can read minds, and you can levitate, and use the whole netherworld of psychic energy. I also love the quote, unlearn what you have learned. And this reminds me of material from Castaneda's books, such as stalking one's personal history that triggers and causes emotional reactions, which basically is cognitive behavioral therapy. This is also illustrated in the I don't believe it, this is why you fail quote. And when Yoda admonishes Luke for always looking away into the horizon and imagining the future, and how he basically admonishes him for not being in the present moment to focus on the here and now, that totally echoes from Carlos Castaneda's books and the teachings of Don Juan. Now, in regards to the going into the cave, this is all about facing the evil within oneself and how you are your greatest enemy. Luke's failure in the cave shows how he allowed aggression and hate to cloud his judgment. This was exemplified when Yoda tells him, your weapons, you will not need them, before he enters the cave, and Luke takes the weapons anyway, which was signifying Luke's fear and aggression. This cave scene also foreshadows that Vader is his father. I also like the notion that Lucas introduces, in which he draws parallels between the devil tempting Jesus in the desert. George Lucas states, the film was originally set up as a spooky movie, as a horror kind of film. Now the emphasis is on the love story. Luke in the desert sequence was really a horror film sequence, like The Exorcist, dealing with the devil. This can be developed into a good conflict. Basically, Jesus' temptation in the desert scene. It would be interesting, a good idea, if in this one, Vader tries to tempt Luke. Furthermore, this scene where Luke has a struggle with his faith is very profound. I really enjoy the dialogue spoken here and the message that's being conveyed by Yoda when he says, size matters not. Judge me by my size. And ultimately, Luke cannot believe that he is able to have the power to move the X Wing, to remove the X Wing out of the waters that it is submerged in. He says, I don't believe it. And then Yoda shows him that size doesn't matter. What matters is having faith in the Force. And then he says, that is why you fail. Now, despite Luke having faith when fighting the Death Star in the previous film, in this film he struggles with faith and believing. He is impatient and temperamental. And I really like how they make Luke into a flawed character because it makes the character more accessible and more relatable. And again, this is another lesson that Luke has to learn. He failed with the lesson in the cave, and he fails here. And he also fails in his fight with Darth Vader, but ultimately, he is victorious. Even though he loses the physical fight, he wins the victory for his soul because he does not give in to the temptation to give in to the dark side once Vader offers him that power to join him. Luke refuses, and he would rather choose death when he allows himself to fall down the shaft. I really enjoy the lessons that are being conveyed in this film. Now, when Luke leaves without completing his training, it illustrates his lack of impatience. But something that I find interesting is how Luke has visions of his friends being hurt and killed, and how he allows these visions to make erroneous decisions, similar to how Anakin's visions of Padme's death caused Anakin to make bad decisions in Revenge of the Sith. Furthermore, Luke also allows a brief vision of his nephew doing terrible things to make him have a hasty and terrible reaction when he briefly contemplates killing his nephew in The Last Jedi. This shows us that the Skywalkers really struggle with self fulfilling prophecies and struggle with their fear, and how their fear causes them to make bad decisions. Now, in regards to George Lucas having to be on set due to the film being over budget and behind schedule, while at the same time having to allow Irving Kirschner be the director and be hands off, George Lucas states, "This is only the second of my pictures that I haven't directed after More American Graffiti. It's been a unique experience to write down something the way I thought it should be, explain to the director how it was supposed to be done, describe the ambience, and then have it come out completely different from the way I thought of it. It's an interesting experience, and I can now see why screenwriters go crazy." Alan Arnold, writer of A Journal of the Making of Empire, says to Kurtz of Lucas's previous visit, "There were times when he thought, well, I would have done it another way. He indicated sometimes, although he admitted that he was never there to see the day to day problems, that he felt that if he'd been directing, he could have gotten things done more quickly, based on his experience on the last film." Now, this interesting interview with Gary Kurtz brings up more of the conflicts and controversies and just creative differences that were encountered on set. Do you feel that you could have exerted, and he didn't say you could have exerted more pressure throughout upon people and upon situations to speed it up? "It's possible in certain situations," Kurtz replies, "but it's a delicate thing. Working with a director who hasn't done this type of picture, it's difficult to explain in advance that certain scenes are very, very complicated and you have to simplify them as much as possible. I think there are certain scenes that could have been done much faster. But Kirsch's style of working is entirely different from George's, and he has a harder time adjusting to problems." Production supervisor Robert Watts provides a quote that illustrates the relationship between Irving Kirschner and Gary Kurtz. "Gary didn't form a relationship with Kirschner. He didn't establish the relationship between producer and director, and that's the most important one of the production. His heart was in the right place, but he wasn't good with people. When you're producing, you need to be able to talk to every type of person. I think the skill of producing is being able to do that. His personality, however, is such that some people, I think, find it a little difficult because he is, I suppose, introverted is the right word. I do believe that I'm quite good with people, and I think that has to be a plus in these circumstances, because certainly Gary does not have the common touch. Kirschner adds, I didn't really work with Gary that much. I worked with the production people mostly, and he was back there working with them, I guess. I didn't think of Gary as an actual part of the production manager team. He was sort of involved in some kind of supervisorial way. I had a very friendly relationship with him, and that's about it. Kirch replies, my relationship with Kirsch did fray a bit. He was under pressure from the financing side, and I was under pressure from the production side to get it done as quickly as possible. And so it did fray our relationship. But I always felt that the sequel to Star Wars was going to be a big hit no matter what, just because of the nature of the expectations. So we therefore had to look at it on the basis of yes, all right, it is costing a little bit more and it's gone over budget, but it has to be better or it's not going to work. So that was one of the arguments that I had with George. I think that's where we disagreed the most. Whenever this came up about Kirsch working slowly, I would say, look at the rushes. The performances are really good. It's working really well, and it's going to surprise everybody. But it was difficult. There's no question about that. Mark Hamill elaborates on some of the conflicts on set. Everyone's tempers were on edge. Since Kirsch knows so much in his mind what he wants to see, he has a tendency to act things out for you, which is not one of my favorite things in life. One time he said, when you do that, don't do, and he did some sort of face. It was his interpretation of what he thought I did, which peeved me to the point where it got into a tug of war. I said, I don't do that. He said, yes, you did. Blah, 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 to the point where he said, okay, you just go see the movie and you'll know you did. And I said, I don't even want to see this movie. It was real, baby, but probably that was good. Because then he said, oh, really? You're not going to see? Okay, cut the lights, cut the camera, cut everything. Why even shoot it? He doesn't even want to go see it. Then everyone feels terribly guilty seconds later. Kurtz elaborates on the little dispute between Mark Hamill and Kirschner. Mark and Kirsch both got angry. They were working under very difficult circumstances. In this case, I think Kirsch felt that Mark wasn't listening to what he was saying about how he was doing something, and Mark felt that Kirsch was acting out everything for him, and he didn't feel good about that. Now it's gotten to the point where I've made sure that they talk at the beginning of each day and go over the material in advance. Kirschner elaborates on the difficulties on working on the Yoda scenes. It would take 3 hours of rehearsal to do one line, Kirschner explains. I'd have my television set and my headphones on, and I'd say, Yoda, stand up. Yoda would stand up. You're too straight. Hump down a little. Too much. Now look up at Mark. But Yoda's eyes were focused on something close, so we have to refocus them. Then I'd say, your left eye is more focused than your right eye, so the little eyelid would lift up. Now start your line, take a step, and sigh. Okay, try again. Finally, after hours and hours of work, it started to happen. Now on Sunday, July 15th, George Lucas returned to London. Suddenly showing up every few weeks or so didn't work anymore. I had to be there every day, and I had to be helping Kirschner, which developed into a lot of work. Howard Kazanjian, producer of Return of the Jedi, who would replace Gary Kurtz, provides a quote. There were some business mistakes that were made. Empire got out of hand budget-wise, and the picture ran into big problems. Part of it was Charlie Weber's fault, and a lot of it was Gary Kurtz's. George Lucas adds, it became apparent that Empire was going to go even further over budget, further over schedule. It wasn't going to be 25 million, it was going to be closer to 30 million. I said, Gary, now we have to go back to the bank again and God knows what's going to happen. They may not extend the loan. But we went to the bank and the bank said, no, we're not giving you another dime. So I couldn't finish the movie. We were like 20% away from finishing the movie, and I was afraid I was going to have to go back to Fox and beg forgiveness. I would have to give them the movie, and then I wouldn't have my freedom. All the money I had made from Star Wars was committed to this film, plus more. But I didn't want to go to Fox and give them the movie because I'd have to give all the rights back. I was very close to losing all the rights after I'd worked so hard to get them. It was an extremely high pressurized situation. I had to keep the picture going, somehow get people to work without pay, hope to hell we could make a deal with another bank, hope to hell that whatever they asked for didn't involve me having to go back and renegotiate big time with Fox. We had to switch banks in a period of something like 10 days, but they were willing to go the extra 5 million. I wanted my independence so badly. We managed to do it in a way that I paid Fox just a little bit more money, but they didn't get any of the licensing and they didn't get any of the sequels. If I had to pay a few extra points, I could do that. I think Fox was just as concerned as we were that the movie get finished. Unless you've got somebody at the helm on a day to day level trying to cut everything down, it just doesn't happen. Gary is trying, but ultimately, Kirsch is the one in the driver's seat, and he just isn't in the same school as I am. It's understandable. Most directors aren't. They're concerned about making movies, not about saving money. They just want to make the film as good as possible, which is what they're paid to do. Kirsch was working very hard trying to get the movie done, but it was very slow and tedious work. So I had to really come in and kind of get very involved to try to see if we could salvage it before I ran out of money. Lucas also worked with Kirschner to speed up the shooting in general. I'd say, do this overall master, says Lucas, referring to a standard kind of setup in which the camera is able to take in the whole set, all the actors, and the complete scene, usually followed by 2 and 3 shots and then close ups of the actors. And Kirsch would say, but I'm not going to use that shot. Why would I do it? And Lucas would say, you do it because it gets everybody on their toes. It gets the makeup done more quickly. It gets the set lit. Everything is done more quickly, and everybody knows what's going on. They'll watch the scene and think, okay, now we're going to go in and cover this. Kirsch is more artistically inclined than I am, but personally, I think that if you have a group of people trying to work on one creative concept, it's better to have everybody clued in to what's actually going on. Now, in regards to the scene where Han is being tortured, I found this scene to be brutal, especially with the fact that the Empire didn't even ask him any questions. Again, this shows the brutality of the Empire, and it really illustrates them as a threat. The way Han Solo screams, it's very, very disturbing and well executed. Some great acting right there. Also, Han getting frozen in carbonite also illustrates another narrative possibility that maybe another one of our heroes won't survive in order to create suspense. Also, when Han finally gets lowered into the freezing chamber, you can really see the unseen tears on his face and how much he loves Leia. And this is such a powerful scene and performance from Harrison Ford, illustrating that sometimes the best performances are simply just expressions and don't necessarily need dialogue. Now, the sorrow on Leia's face as Han is lowered into the carbonite freezing chamber is powerful, illustrating excellent acting from Carrie Fisher. You can really feel the deep sadness conveyed in her expression. Also in Chewbacca as well, and it is amazing how essentially a guy in a hairy suit can emote such sorrow and pain with just expressions and with the help of Ben Burtt's sound effects. You can really feel the sadness being conveyed from both these characters. Furthermore, you can also see that Lando is struggling with his guilt, especially when Han is getting tortured, and that he wants to make amends somehow, but he's been placed in a situation where he had no choice. Billy D. Williams' acting is excellent in portraying this. Now, we have been discussing some of the conflicts and issues and struggles that were occurring on the set for the making of The Empire Strikes Back, but I think it's important to note that not everything was such a bad experience, that there was some good things. George Lucas states, "Once in a while when I'm on set, I get a little restless as if I were directing, wishing I could go in there and get it done. But I like what Kirsch is doing creatively. I don't have a strong feeling of wishing it were done another way. Well, perhaps once in a while, but I much prefer that somebody else do the work." Joe Johnston states, "When Kirsch was shooting, George would be over his shoulder whispering this and that. Kirsch did not always agree, so two versions were shot." Kirschner says, "I told George I couldn't work if he would be looking over my shoulder all the time. After all, I had done time with John Peters. George does not stand over me, and he's really, as he says, here to help. He's changed the storyboard for me. He's taken care of parts of the script that needed compressing. He's someone to talk to when I have a little problem, and I get an immediate answer, which is good." George Lucas states, "Kirsch wanted to give the film a slightly more serious tone from what I'd done in the first film, but without taking it completely out of the Saturday matinee feeling. He wanted to get deeper into the characters and make the jokes a little less flippant." Castan states, "George didn't particularly like telling people what to do. He didn't like arguing with them. He didn't like the cajoling that is so much a part of directing. He didn't want to do that, and he had reinvented himself as the producer mastermind of these movies, which had started for me with the creation of Raiders of the Lost Ark. I saw his dealings with Steven Spielberg and Irving Kirschner as very supportive, and yet, trying to guide them into exactly what George wanted. What a great producer does is he guides everyone without making them feel controlled. George was very good and funny and charming in the Georgian manner." Kirschner adds, "George is a very fine editor, and he's taking back all the battle sequences that we shot in Norway. He's going to go through it all and rough it together so that when Paul Hirsch, the editor, and myself go back to San Francisco, we will not be starting with raw footage. We'll be able to say, 'By God, it's there,' or 'No, I want to start over,' or 'Let's fix this, this, and this.' An ordinary producer cannot do that." Now, I think an important thing to note is that in regards to the fate of Han Solo, it wasn't certain if Harrison Ford would return for the third film and continue Han Solo's arc. So, George Lucas, having him placed in carbonite, left it up in the air, left it open to numerous possibilities. Mark Hamill states, "Look at what's happening to Harrison. He wasn't sure if he wanted to repeat his role as Solo, and he's not at all committed to doing a third one. So George has left him in limbo in this one. As Lando Calrissian says after Han is hauled up from the carbon freezing chamber, he's in a state of perfect hibernation. So George has given himself an option." So, with this quote, we can see that putting Han in the carbonite freezing wasn't necessarily a narrative choice that was motivated by artistry, but out of just not being certain whether Harrison Ford wanted to return to play Han Solo in Return of the Jedi. But I'm glad that he did. And all these narrative choices saying that there could be another to replace Luke, Han Solo being put in the carbonite freezing chamber, Lando Calrissian being a traitor, it really contributed to the suspense of the film. It contributed to the feeling that our heroes can possibly die, or possibly never be seen again, or possibly be betrayed. They did a really good job in creating that sense of fear throughout the movie. Now, the lightsaber duel for this film is the best in the entire saga, and it has nothing to do with choreography and everything to do with emotion. The emotion in this duel is so powerful, You can really feel the fear in Luke all throughout the fight and how he walks that fine line between being courageous and afraid. When Vader tells him, I am your father, it shows that not only are you your worst enemy, but your worst enemy in the material world is also your father, which is devastating on an emotional level, creating an emotional climax that is better than any climactic action battle sequence or climactic lightsaber duel. Now, when Luke falls, it symbolizes how he has chosen death over joining the dark side, because death is better than fear and despair. So, Luke choosing death over joining Vader actually, for me, shows that he was able to overcome the enemy within himself because he did not give in to that temptation to join Darth Vader, that temptation to be evil. He did not give in to the enemy within himself, and he chose death, and that was the right choice. And ultimately, he is saved by Leia, which is an act of hope. When he is hanging from the bottom of Cloud City and he is pleading to Leia for her to hear him, and he is hoping that she hears him, that is hope triumphing over fear when she hears him and she rescues him. It's a very powerful scene and a very powerful message. And the film ends with this impending urgency looming over our protagonists, our heroes, and we contemplate the possible fate of Han and Luke. And the ending to The Empire Strikes Back is the best cliffhanger in cinematic history. An ending that truly makes us think hard about what we just saw and what's to come for our heroes and villains. The Empire Strikes Back is one of the greatest films of all time. It's an art house masterpiece that is a beautifully crafted, poetical, character driven piece that is about facing the darkness within oneself and seeing the universal message of being one with the greater universe that is embedded in all humanity and all living things. This film truly is poetry in motion, and this film was created by the blood, sweat, and tears of all the collaborators involved, even if there was many conflicts and creative differences. These conflicts, these issues help make the film what it is today. The contributions of the many talented individuals such as George Lucas, Irving Kirschner, Gary Kurtz, John Williams, Loris Kasdan, Lee Brackett, Ben Burt, all these individuals, Dennis Murin and his peers at Industrial Light and Magic, help make the film what it is today. And not only is the film a masterpiece in the cinematic sense, but this film represents a victory over the studio system. The success of this film truly cemented Lucasfilm as a truly independent studio and allowed George Lucas to expand his Lucasfilm empire with Skywalker Ranch, Industrial Light and Magic, and Skywalker Sound, and the numerous other companies that he founded. The Empire Strikes Back truly is one of the greatest films of all time. Thank you guys for listening to this review and in-depth analysis. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and share. May the Force be with you. And last but not least, one love, people. Take care.